folks. I figured today we're going to be doing a repair and startup on an old Kohler light plant, and I ended up getting this at the same place that I got my Nelson Brothers generator. If some of you remember from, I think about 2 years ago in the wintertime, I did a repair and startup on that. Anyways, these both came from the same estate, and I had this sitting out back on a pallet, and I figured it's time to get the thing fired up and see if it puts out power and if the engine runs and whatnot. So it is kind of a nifty little generator. It's only 3.5 kilowatts, so 3,500 watts. And the nice thing is it spins at 1,800 RPM, so it's not screaming loud when it's running and running at full tilt, which I do kind of like. I'm not sure of the year on it. If I had to guess, probably late 60s, early 70s, judging by some of the stuff on the Kohler here. They don't have a serial number on this tag, so I can't run the date on it. They only have a spec number, and unfortunately, at least from what I know of, Kohler never released any of their spec numbers, so you really can't find much on those. Anyways, the engine does roll over. It had a stuck valve, so it didn't roll over all the way. And last night, when I finished work, I got the garage cleaned up and this on here, I realized that it also has electric start. So I figured, hey, we might as well give that a shot. So I put a battery on here, hit the starter button here without thinking that it had a stuck exhaust valve. And the engine whipped over and I heard a loud snap. And the valve is no longer stuck. So I don't know if it broke the valve, if it broke a lifter, if it broke the cam, or if it just moved the valve. So we're going to have to check on that first before we do anything else to this thing and see if I ended up ruining it. But we'll have to see. I got plenty of Kohler parts around anyways. But aside from that, the generator head itself, and I didn't realize this until last night, these are the output wires for the generator. That's all it has on here. So somebody might have had this hardwired into a building somewhere, and given where it came from, I wouldn't be surprised. So everything underneath this cover on the top does look pretty good. There's a little bit of a broken piece right here where I believe that would be where the main juice comes out of this thing. But we're gonna have to get it running and play around with the meter and see what's putting out what and whether it's even a good generator head, because worst case, all I'm gonna do is pull a generator head off, scrap that, and keep the engine, which I have done before on these little Kohler gen sets that are junk. So anyways, can't guarantee nothing, folks, but we might as well start tearing into this Kohler, get the head off of this thing, and see what's going on with that stuck valve. Alright, so the first thing that I have to do before pulling off this head is get this spark plug off of here. And as you can see, it's got a shielded wire coming up on it, which is braided, almost like a hydraulic line. And from what I read about back in the day, a lot of the generators had spark plugs like this on them, or wire setups. And some of the Briggs, some of you might know, they had a little cap over the spark plug with a bail that would come up almost like a mason jar. So they did that apparently so that way it wouldn't interrupt radio signals and whatnot if you were running a generator, which I thought was kind of interesting. Not something that you see nowadays, but it's definitely a unique design, and it's new to me too, because I've never dealt with one of these ones before. I've had generators here with just the little caps on them, and those ones just have a regular old spark plug underneath versus one of these fangled things. And this is a champion though. So it's really just, if you can see it, it's just a regular spark plug coming out the bottom, but it's the wire and the insulator and everything that goes into it, which kind of makes it unique. So anyways, at least that came out in one piece and easier than I figured. Now, I'm going to get all these head bolts out. This last one here has a little heat sensor on it, which I think is kind of neat. I don't know if it shuts down the engine or what it does, but it is kind of nifty. Doesn't look too bad underneath. Someone's definitely cleaned it before. There's scrape marks, and there's also never sees on all the bolts. So it must have been in use at least for a while. Like I said, I kind of figured it was hardwired in somewhere. And it does have a stuck exhaust valve on it, which it looks like it's just about up all the way, at least from what it feels like while the lobe is hitting it. So more than likely last night when I hooked the battery to it and thought it was a good idea without remembering about this, I bet you it ended up loosening, well, not loosening it up, but I bet you there was enough force to snap it all the way up, and then it just stuck there. So I'd venture to say that the cam and everything is okay. It just sent that thing to the moon underneath all that pressure, which luckily didn't seem to break anything. Alright, well, let's get that exhaust valve freed up, and then we'll see about cleaning up the head of this thing. So to free up this exhaust valve, this kind of goes hand in hand with my redneck valve job that you guys have seen me do, is we're going to spray a little bit of oil down the stem here, and then roll the engine over so that way it's pushing up the intake valve. That way you know the lobe isn't pushing up on the bottom of this. And I guess you could say the proper way to do this would be to take everything apart and drive the valve out from the bottom with a punch, but it's an awful lot of work just for a stuck exhaust valve, and I'd almost guarantee that it moved when I cranked this thing over the other night. So I'm just going to take a little rubber mallet and tap it, see if that does anything, which it doesn't seem to be moving. This isn't actually the finest idea either, because you can also snap the stem off inside. And another resort would be doing this, if you can get it dead center on the center of the valve so it doesn't warp the head. Alright, so it is moving, just not very well. And the cam is pushing it back up. So what we're going to do is just keep working it up and down a little bit and see if we can get that oil to work its way down the valve stem into the guide. Hopefully you guys can see that where I put the camera. It is moving it up and down. It's just going to take a little bit of doing. So I'm going to work it up and down like this for a little bit. And then once it seems like it's starting to free up a little, what I'll do is I'll take the channel locks and I'll grab the head of it and I'll twist it and then move it up and down. That way it kind of gets the oil into the valve guide a little bit. At least that's the initial goal. You can hit them like this, but you got to hit them really square or else you can bend the head one way or another. Alright, so I'm going to keep working this thing around and then I'll check back with you folks once I get the thing freed up. Now that it's freed up enough, you can grab the head of it and turn it around a little bit, and that'll kind of help work the oil down, help free up some of that crap that's sticking it. still just a little sticky, but it's almost there. And being that I can now turn it by hand, that's always a good sign too. So now we can do what my original intent was last night and hook up this battery and crank it over. Make sure everything's moving all right at a higher speed. Looks good to me, folks. Well, luckily nothing broke when I did that last night and cranked the thing over with a stuck valve. So now that we're moving freely again, what I am going to do is get this head cleaned up, and then we'll be ready for a new head gasket and to torque the head back down. And I might as well measure this cylinder too while I'm in here just for kicks to see where it's at, see how worn it is. Cylinder head's all cleaned up, so I got that all scraped down and I ran over it with a little bit of 400 grit sandpaper to shine it up, and it cleaned up fairly well. The cylinder is also still in pretty good shape. It's a little bit glazed up, but there's no lips or anything from the rings coming up on the piston and wearing in. So I measured that, and it's actually still within tolerance, which is good, because for the K301 Kohler, right there above my fingernail is the standard bore tolerance, and then this is your wear limit here, the 3.378, and as you can see on my calipers, this came in at 3.376. So that's still within the wear limit for what this cylinder is. I use a snap gauge when I measure these. I don't have proper bore gauges. I haven't bought any yet, but the snap gauges are pretty darn accurate if you use them properly and with a set of calipers, and that's generally how I measure all my bores. So that's all squared away. I also cleaned up the head, and that came out fairly well. Same deal, scraped it down, brake cleaner, and then a little bit of 400 on the mating surface there. And I usually run these through the glass bead cabinet if it's a customer's machine, because it'll blow all the carbon out and it'll clean them up like they just came out of the foundry. But for what this thing is, that'll be good enough. So with everything cleaned up, now we can get back to torquing down the head and get that all squared away. Alright, so we have a new head gasket on here. I also went ahead and cleaned up all of the head bolts, scraped off all the old never sees, and just put a dab of new stuff on there. So that's all ready to go. So now we can go ahead and torque the head down, and as you can see here underneath my index finger, that is the head bolt torque pattern for the K301 Kohler from 10 horse to 14, and the 16 is next to it just in case anybody needs that and you can't find it online. So these get torqued down, as you can see, at 25-30 foot-pounds, and that's where we're going to put it down to. So I usually start at 10 and then I go to 15 and then I go to 30 on everything, just so it gets a nice even torque. This does have a graphite head gasket in it, not the metal ones. I like the metal ones a lot better, but for what this thing is, I figured I'd use up the graphite head gaskets that I have, because I'm at the tail end of them. So on these ones, usually graphite, you're definitely going to want to torque down a lot more evenly, because it's a softer head gasket and it's going to want to squish a lot more. And in some cases, you also want to retorque them after you run them, because when it heats up, it might loosen up just a little bit, because once again it's a graphoil gasket. It's not a hard metal gasket like most head gaskets are, so you might have to retorque them. So anyways, we're just going to start at 10 and work our way up to 30, and then this head will be all set and squared away. And now that our head is back together and torqued down, I just screwed in the plug to see what we have for compression. And if this picks it up, so we do have compression. It's not as much as what it could have, but obviously it's a lot better than what it had before with a stuck valve. So with what it has though, it definitely will run without issue. So the next thing I'm going to do is the ignition system on here. This does have the under the flywheel magneto ignition system that some of these Kohlers had, so you don't have to have a 12 volt automotive style ignition, or battery ignition rather. So what I'm just going to do is we're going to clean up the points here and set them and see if we have spark, because if we don't and I have to pull off that flywheel, I got to make sure I have one of those systems out back that's good first. And if I don't, then there's no sense in going any further with this project. So I get that points cover off and take a look underneath. Looks like what they did. I don't think you guys can see it from where you're at right now. You might be able to see it once I get the cover off of here. You can see how this wire is all shielded with that same braided stuff that is on the plug wire. And what I noticed here is they have a tail coming off of the braid with a little ring terminal that hooks onto the lower screw for the points box, which is kind of neat. So it looks like they had grounds all over the place on the wires, so that way it, I would assume, wouldn't interfere with radio signals or anything else with this generator head possibly. So that's kind of neat. You know, the points look fairly decent. They're corroded, of course, from sitting, but they don't look like they're that old, so someone was working on this at some point in time, and it looks like they even made a homemade points cover gasket, so those will clean up all right. So we'll get those cleaned up, reset, and then we can check for spark. Alrighty, points are all cleaned up and gapped. These get set to 20 thousandths, as do all Kohler engines. And I also figured I'd just show you guys, this is the wire that I had mentioned. As you can see, it's braided and wrapped around this entire harness for the ignition system. That goes up behind the flywheel, and this is the plug wire with that same hydraulic hose style braiding to it, and it just has a little ring terminal that hooks onto the screw right there. So I imagine that's just to keep it grounded out, which is kind of interesting. Never seen it before, so thought that was pretty cool. I got the battery hooked up to the electric start, so now we can check the points for spark, or check the ignition system for spark rather. I'd say that's pretty darn good. Hopefully the camera picked that up. We have a nice blue spark that's snapping across that spark plug, and luckily enough the spark plug is still good too. So with that, now that we have a good ignition system, I'm going to take apart this carburetor and take a look inside, and we can start addressing the fuel system too, because this pump does have what's left of someone's fuel system on it, because they were running it off of an auxiliary can. So we'll get the carburetor apart, we can look into that, and then after the carburetor we can pull the fuel pump apart too and look inside of that, make sure the diaphragm is okay. That air filter has seen better days. So this carburetor does have a heat activated choke right here on the manifold, which I thought was pretty neat because I don't usually see those all that often. The linkage has since been removed for it, so I don't know if this ever worked at one point or maybe it stopped working and somebody took the linkage off of it. So we're just going to leave it like that and just move this by hand, which luckily everything still moves on this carburetor. Yeah, there you have it. There's a little bit of rust and corrosion in the throat of the carburetor there from it sitting, but really nothing all that bad. So we'll have to see what it looks like inside the bowl when we take that off. A little crispy, but not all that bad. It's got some old dried up gas on the bottom of the bowl, if you guys can see that. And it looks like a little bit of water from when I power washed this thing a couple weeks ago. Float looks okay. Gaskets are shot. Float needle still looks good, and the rest of the carburetor actually looks excellent inside. It looks just about brand new. So really all we're going to have to do with this one is just pull all the needles out of it, clean that out. I don't think I'm going to even run it through the glass bead blaster for that corrosion inside of there. I'll just clean that out with a wire brush. And as long as the main jet up inside there is clean, this will be a pretty easy carburetor clean. See if this main jet comes out of here. And as I'd mentioned in other videos with taking apart carburetors, I ended up making a special screwdriver for taking these Kohler main jets out. As you can see here, it's probably not that noticeable, but I shaved down the end of the screwdriver so I can get the full width of the blade inside of here, and also it doesn't taper down. I think I shaved it this way too, so it's a nice wide blade when it goes into that brass jet, rather than have the end of a flathead screwdriver how they're always tapered like this before they flatten out. So now you can get the full width of that blade in on that jet, and you have a less chance of stripping it out. It makes it a lot easier to install and remove these jets. And there's your main jet. A little bit crispy from the dried gas, but really not all that bad. And down inside the carburetor, yeah, it looks alright. It's really not that bad, but I almost want to run the glass bead blaster down inside of there and just blow it out real quick, because there's just enough powdery or crusty gas in there, which if I don't clean it out and it doesn't come out with the brake cleaner, that's going to cause an issue. So alright, I'll get the rest of these gaskets peeled off of here, which is just a little bit of an O-ring here, and then I'll run this through the blaster. I'm only going to hit inside of here and just inside of here real quick. That way it doesn't take the finish off of the aluminum here, because oddly enough these do corrode a lot faster if you hit them with the glass bead blaster and then you leave them outside or they get moisture on them versus having the original casting. So anyways, thought that was kind of odd, but I'll get this cleaned up and I'll check back with you guys and we can put that back together. Everything's all cleaned up for the carburetor. So I blew this out in the glass bead blaster. As you can see, I went around where the bowl mating surface is for the gaskets. I also blew out inside of the stem, along with the throttle butterfly in the back where all that corrosion was. So that's all nice and cleaned out now. And then I just held this back in the cabinet, probably about 10 inches back from the gun, and just blew it really quick. That way it got off all that light corrosion on the outside. Cleaned it up a little bit, I suppose, just for looks. Bowl I cleaned out with some steel wool. That cleaned out nice. I also blew out the main jet in the glass bead cabinet, along with the bowl nut too, and everything else was in pretty good shape. The float cleaned up with a little bit of steel wool as well. So that's all set, and of course I have all my new gaskets to put this back together. So now we can start with reassembly. So out of all the carburetors and all the small engines, I'd have to say Kohler K-Series and M-Series carburetors are probably about the easiest and fastest carburetors to rebuild, because it's really not all that much to them. So you're going to start with the main jet in the bottom, and then after that I'll usually run in the main jet needle. And like all carburetor needles, you just want to run this in until it seats, just till it stops right there. And for a 12 horse, I'll probably run this out 2 times, probably about 2 or 2.5 for a 12, and then we could put in the idle needle on the side here, idle mixture needle, and that can run out about 1 or 1.5 turns. Should probably put some oil on that spring, that way I can actually feel if it seats or not. And these ones, the idle needles on these Kohlers, you can also see them, just the tip of the needle stick through inside of the throat there. So when it seats, you'll just be able to see that poke through. So we'll back this off 1.5 times, and that'll just get you close so you can get the thing running. Usually if you have a 14 or a 16 horse, sometimes this main jet on top has to go out 2.5 to 3 times, and sometimes this side one will have to go out 2 to 2.5, depending on how the engine runs. But that's usually about where I start when I put everything back in. So after those go in, we're going to want to do the float needle seat. And that just threads into the bottom here, and it takes a 3/8 socket, and you have to have a really thin walled socket, that way you can get over the needle seat and down past the stanchions for the float where the pin goes through. So I ended up finding a socket from a real cheesy sockets that I've had since I was a kid, and it was just thin wall enough and crappy enough, it wasn't the best made, where it slides down in between everything, and it is really snug because sometimes it gets stuck like it just did here, but it fit down there a lot better than the Husky set that I have in the toolbox here. Alright, so that's in, and now I can put this O-ring in first because it's easier to push it into the groove like that. It's a lot easier to do it like so before the float goes back on, because you can actually get your fingers around it. So the float needle goes in, that's still in good shape. I usually, once again, if it's a customer's carburetor, or sometimes even on my own stuff when it gets used a lot, I'll just put a new kit in it because they're fairly cheap and all this stuff would get replaced. But because this generator is probably going to run for about 15 or 20 minutes at the most and then go back up on the hill and sit for who knows how long, we're not going to put a kit into it. So I just have spare, these are extra gaskets out of kits and stuff that I had kicking around. Alright, so now our float is pinned in there, and to set a Kohler float, they're really simple to do. It's the same thing with the Briggs that I had showed a few videos back on a generator, I believe, is all you have to do is bend the tang on the bottom of the float, and these sit level. So when you look at it sideways like this, this is going to sit level the same distance from the bottom of the float to the carburetor body on either side, and that's how these Kohler floats get set. Alright, and then the baffle goes on here, and all this baffle really does is just keeps the gas from splashing back up the vent tube on the side of the carburetor right here, and it also does seal the bowl up because it does go over that O-ring. So now that that's all set, the bowl can go on, and that's got enough sealing room. But what I usually do with these is, if I'm reusing an old bowl, because when you tighten this down and it mates up against those bowl gaskets, when you tighten the nut, it's going to pull the inside of this bowl down like this. So when you replace everything and put it back on, it's not going to suck down as tight. So all I do with these is I'll just flip them up, I'll go around the inside, and I'll just whack that bottom surface of the bowl, I guess you could say, flat again. That way with the new gaskets, it has enough room to squish and pull everything down. That way you know you get a good seal. And you can do that with any bowls that are of this style, like the Briggs. I think I've even done it to Tecumseh's before if they're really warped, and of course the Kohlers. And then I have a new O-ring gasket on our bowl nut. Snug that down, and there you have it, folks. Now your Kohler carburetor is ready to get mounted back up. So now that that's squared away, we're going to pull that fuel pump apart and take a look inside of there. Wow, I guess somebody really wound that one in there. I'm also not going to put back on this glass fuel bowl. What? Nice going. Anyways, what I am going to do is just put a fuel elbow into this fuel pump when all is said and done, because I'm just going to clamp an auxiliary tank to one of the legs on the generator to run it. So it sounds like the diaphragm's either barely moving. No, that's actually, it's exactly what it feels like, actually. It's probably solidified in there. Well, aside from some parts washer fluid inside, everything else is dry as a bone. Which is nice, because that means there's no residual crust and stuff from the old gas. Check valves are still moving. Diaphragm's stiff as a board though, holy crap. So that's going to have to get replaced. Unfortunately, I'm waiting on a stock order of these fuel pump diaphragms, which I ordered probably at least a week or so ago. About 10 of them. They were supposed to be here yesterday, which was Friday. So I figured they'd show up today, and they still haven't showed up today. So it looks like I'm just going to stuff this back in, and what we'll do is we'll just run the fuel line directly into the carburetor to run this instead of putting a new diaphragm on it. And this is also actually, not only is it stiff as a board and really isn't moving that well anymore, you see how I can spin that around like that? If I reuse this diaphragm and ran fuel through this pump, what it would end up doing is leaking fuel into the crankcase, because this is no longer crimped on here tight. So over time the fuel is going to work its way in between the washer and the diaphragm material, and then it's going to end up coming through the bottom here. I've seen it happen a bunch of times on these old Kohlers, so unfortunately, no matter what, it's a junk diaphragm, but that does happen. So if you end up with fuel inside of a crankcase of a Kohler K or M series, check your fuel pump, because more than likely the diaphragm is ripped and it's running in, because that's really the only way that you can get fuel into the crankcase of a Kohler K or M single cylinder engine, at least. So aside from a bad diaphragm though, everything else looks good. So I'm just gonna wipe this thing out, put the diaphragm back into it, button it back up, get this mounted back up onto the engine, and then we can mount the carburetor back up on as well. Alright folks, so we're just about ready to fire it up. So what I went ahead and did is I put my test exhaust on that I use for running Kohler engines that I rebuild. So we have somewhat of an exhaust. I also unwrapped the two leads that come out of this generator head. I'm assuming these are the ones that went to the power source or whatever they were powering with this generator, because they're the only two leads sticking out of this thing, unless some of them hooked onto those bus blocks right here. But we'll play around with the meter and see what does what. Like I said, I'm assuming that these are the ones that'll have juice on it when it's running. So the electric start wires leave a lot to be desired, but it's enough to crank the thing over for the time being, and those will work just fine. So I got to clean up the tools, roll this thing out, and then we can clamp our fuel tank bracket to this, get some fuel into it, and we'll be all ready to fire up. Alright folks, so we're all set up and ready to go. I have my test tank on here. I got the battery hooked up, and of course our exhaust is all set. And all of our supposedly live wires are out of the way. And it doesn't look like our carburetor is leaking. So, we're all ready to crank this thing over. So all the smoke has seemed to have burned off, which I'm pretty sure was just all the penetrating oil I put down into the exhaust valve to get that freed up. So I checked a bunch of spots on the generator and I wasn't getting any juice. There's nothing coming out of these two wires on the side, so I'm not all that sure what those are for. But when I do put the prongs down into this block on the top, let's see if I can do this with the camera. If I go down into these two, we do have power. Come on. There we go. So we got about 135 volts, give or take, AC. So the generator head is good. It is putting out juice. It just needs to get wired with plugs, and then it'll be all set to use. And it's actually kind of a nice little unit, because this is full tilt right here. And of course I'm yelling so you guys can hear me on the camera, but it's actually pretty darn quiet. It's a lot quieter than I figured it would be. So if you put a nice big muffler on this thing, it'll be actually a pretty slick backup generator. Granted, it doesn't put out a ton of power for nowadays. It's only 3,500 watts, but that's enough to run what you have to when the power goes out. It wouldn't be a bad generator, backup generator for a shop either, or a small garage or something like that. So Kohler definitely sounds good though. It's got just a little bit of a valve tick, but nothing too much to worry about. Can't beat them, folks. They're just fine engines. That's a pretty darn good running Kohler right there. So luckily enough, everything works on it. It's a great running engine. It's a nice running generator. Everything puts out fine and all that. So it is good. I was hoping that it would be. I didn't really want to have to strip the head off of this thing and junk it. So it's definitely a nice generator unit to have on hand, even though I have a whole mess of them here as it is. But I think I'll sell this one and maybe sell off some of the other ones. I do have some that you guys haven't seen yet. So what I'm going to do is finish getting this thing prepped for storage now. I'm going to get rid of this stack exhaust off of here and drain out the fuel from the carburetor bowl. I already have the fuel pump all plugged off for the time being. Get the air cleaner back on there, and then I'll get the metal shroud or the cover back onto this control panel for the generator. Got everything buttoned back up and ready for storage. I dropped the bowl off the carburetor, drained and dried all that out, sprayed a little bit of WD-40 in there. Also sprayed some down the throat of the carburetor. Fuel pump is all blocked off. I got the stack muffler off of there. I'm waiting for it to cool down all the way, and then I'm going to put one of these plastic plugs down inside to keep some of the moisture out, hopefully, and of course if any mice want to get in there. I have the hood back on the control panel. I might see if I can get something plugged into there or stuffed in there to keep the mice out of it, though of course, as most of you know, if the mice want to get into some place, they're going to get in there. I also plugged off a couple of the holes on the back with some red plugs just to try to help it, but we'll have to see. So anyways, folks, I'm pretty happy with this. I'm glad I got it running, and I'm glad I picked it up too from that estate. It's a nice running little unit. It's quiet, 1800 RPMs. It's a great little backup generator for something of that nature, and maybe someday I'll be able to put this thing to good use, because of course it's powered by none other than a K-Series Kohler, so you can't beat it. But anyways, folks, there you have it. That's the repair and startup of the Kohler electric plant.